This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, where we talk every week about books and research and other fascinating things that have caught our attention. I'm your co-hostess, Dalia Shenlin.
And I'm your co-host, Gilad Halpern. This episode is brought to you by the Israel Democracy Institute, and it is part of our special series in partnership with the Institute, focused on the Israeli elections in April. And we are making a special appeal first that if you like us, please show it. We need your support. Please give to our show by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and you'll see a big red button that says Patreon. Click on it and support us. Thank you so much. Today we are very pleased to welcome back Yohanan Plesner. He is the president of the Israel Democracy Institute and a former member of the Israeli Knesset himself from 2007 to 2013, when he served with the party Kadima. We're here to ask what is happening in the Israeli political system and how is Israeli democracy changing. Hello, Yohanan Plesner, and welcome back to the show.
Hello, and thanks for having me.
So let's start with the most unprecedented element of these elections, the Israel Attorney General's announcement that the incumbent Prime Minister, Netanyahu, who is running for his fifth re-election, that's a fourth consecutive term, should be indicted pending a hearing. What do you see as really the main significance of this in a long-term sense? Do you think it is good news or bad news for Israeli democracy?
Well, as you mentioned, we are entering uncharted territories. It's truly unprecedented that an Israeli prime minister is being indicted while in office. So we don't have any past precedents to help guide us deal with this unique situation. Is it good or bad news? It's good news in the sense that we have independent law enforcement institutions that are able to apply the rule of law even to the strongest, most powerful people in the country, including the prime minister that has been in office for 10 years, the most powerful individual in Israeli public life. And nevertheless, our independent law enforcement agencies and leaders are applying the rule of law also with respect to Mr. Netanyahu. This is the side of the good news. It's bad news in the sense that the seeming issue of the election campaign right now is, do I trust or distrust our law enforcement institutions, i.e. the police, the Attorney General, and the entire Justice Ministry staff, whereby Mr. Netanyahu's campaign increasingly seems like a campaign that is designed to undermine the credibility of the very institutions that we have in place.
So the democratic institutions in Israel have been politicized and weaponized for purposes of
I don't think they have been politicized, but the credibility in those institutions is being undermined right now, and whether or not you trust them is there's an attempt to turn it into a political question. So far, we're seeing that big portions of public opinion are not buying it.
But actually, let's explain this for a second, because what Gilad said is that they are being weaponized. What I think is actually happening, and you tell me if this is correct, is that Netanyahu's response to the charges has been that the courts are biased politically.
Yeah.
Is that what he's saying? Explain what his response has been.
Yeah, well, Mr. Netanyahu, the indictment or the intention to indict subject to the outcome of a hearing was recently announced, and the response at the very same day by Prime Minister Netanyahu was, well, this decision is politically motivated, politically biased, unprecedented, and in a sense, illegitimate. What he's doing, he's basically undermining the public trust in the motivations of our law enforcement institutions. This underlines a very worrying reality in which we have today one individual, namely the Prime Minister of the State of Israel, who is serving in two different roles, two different positions. Number one, he's the head of state, the head of the executive branch, in charge of our law enforcement institutions and individuals. He's supposed to appoint head of police very soon, to appoint the next attorney general, and so on. So he's the head, and he's supposed to strengthen them, back them, and augment their ability to fight corruption and criminal acts. And at the same time, he's the most famous suspect in the country for a very severe allegations of bribery and misallocation of public funds and decision making. And can one individual serve in those two capacities of the number one suspect and the number one leader of our executive
You say
branch?
serve in capacities as if being a suspect is a role he has to play.
From a normative, moral, and ethical standpoint, obviously those two roles do not overlap. And theoretically and normatively, one person cannot be both in charge of law enforcement and the number one suspect. However, what we've seen on Thursday is not... We are beyond theory.
Tell us what happened on Thursday. Because
what we've seen just recently is that Mr. Netanyahu is using his capacity as prime minister to target and attack not only the institutions of law enforcement and specifically the Attorney General's staff, the state prosecutor, but individuals using rhetoric of so far was a rhetoric that was only used by criminals, of attacking them on a personal level, attacking the credibility of the prosecutors from the office of prime minister.
and naming them.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's assume, which I don't think it's very likely, but let's assume that Netanyahu is changing his strategy and he stops attacking the law enforcement agencies personally or not, and says, which is something with some degree of merit. He says, well, I have the benefit of the doubt, right? The presumption of innocence. I haven't been convicted yet. I will fight for my innocence and let, the courts do their job. Say that this happens tomorrow morning. Do you think that he could potentially continue to serve as prime minister? Or do you think that the fact that there is a prime minister who is a suspect in very serious corruption charges is ipso facto contradicting, the democratic norms that we would like to see in this country?
Well, it's a good question because, it's assuming Netanyahu would behave in a public manner in a way that sort of one would expect from a prime minister, it would change the way we look at it. At the same time, the same prime minister who's a suspect of very severe crimes is supposed to very soon nominate a chief of police. The police is in charge of the Israeli FBI, so to speak, of the investigative unit against corruption. He's supposed to nominate a chief prosecutor. So, it does introduce...
Well, he did last time round.
What you're saying is that even if he behaves differently about the charges, it doesn't resolve the conflict of interest.
Yes, and so there's a moral and ethical problem about being a suspect in such severe crimes and continuing to serve as prime minister. From a legal perspective, until a final decision in a hearing is made, the prime minister can remain in office. So there's a difference, I think, from the moral and ethical perspective and from the legal perspective. I think that at the very least, I would expect the prime minister to announce that once a final decision after a hearing is made, then, and assuming the decision would be for him to indict him, that he intends to step aside and focus on clearing his name in court rather than trying to continue to fight for his innocence from the position of a part-time prime minister.
But let me ask you, you talked about that. So far he has not been taking this nice behavior of saying, let the court do this, let the courts do their work. What he's been doing so far is trying to delegitimize them and saying they're politicized. And you mentioned that
initiate
so far
a series of legislations.
Exactly. Well, this is my question. You said that the public so far isn't buying it, but I have to tell you that a survey that was published the very day after the Attorney General announced his decision, which was March 1st, that's the day after, 42% of Israelis said that the Attorney General made his decision based on pressure from the media and the left, which is exactly what Netanyahu's been saying. And I have to tell you also as a pollster, that 42% who agrees with Netanyahu's perspective on this has been very stable. It's about the same number of people who have a favorable opinion of him. No matter what he does, they kind of think he's in the right. And that's not a small portion exactly. And as you say, he's trying to pass legislation to get around the court's decisions. Maybe the public is buying this, and maybe the public will elect representatives who will pass that kind of legislation. Do you think this indicates the start of an attempt to erode the justice system in Israel?
Well, what we're seeing is a significant and consistent portion of Israeli public opinion, of Israelis, that buy that or by that kind of explanation. One can use other words like propaganda as well. At the same time, consistently, we are seeing a big majority of Israelis that oppose so far. I mean,
Sizable.
overwhelming, sizable majority of Israelis that the independence of our court system should be preserved, that the authorities of the court system should be preserved, that have trust and credibility in those institutions, anywhere between 60 and 70% in our law enforcement institutions, and much less in our politicians and political parties, and also in Netanyahu himself. So yes, is that kind of a messaging, is it effective? Yes, it is. But still we have a significant chunk of Israelis who would support decision of our legitimate law enforcement agencies.
Okay, let's assume that he wins the elections, that he manages to eke out a very supportive and loyal coalition, which is, again, not unlikely, and, continues with the same kind of trend, the same kind of strategy to undermine the law enforcement agencies and pass all sorts of legislation that would serve his case. How long do you think the robustness of Israeli law enforcement agencies, the democratic institutions, could last? Where would the tipping point be? How long could it still go on, making these assaults on the democratic institutions until they actually collapse?
I don't see us getting any closer or nearing a tipping point. Israeli law enforcement institutions actually have developed a tradition over 70 years of our independence. I remember with some perspective the case of Aryeh Deri, that people said it's not going to happen. Aryeh Deri, former interior minister, 17 seats in the Knesset, and it was clear in the major demonstrations he ran a campaign of
He is innocent.
He is innocent from bribery,
from charges
and
of
he
bribery.
went into jail, and life continued. So, those institutions, people didn't think that as those institutions of law enforcement and justice dealt with a former president and a former prime minister and a former treasury minister and a former president, and all of them many of them ended up in jail. So I think our institutions are much stronger than any specific individual, although it's true that there's a real challenge from an incumbent prime minister trying to undermine those institutions.
So
this
he's
is
not
unprecedented.
he's not the first. In the sense that the attempt to weaken the independence of the court and weaken the powers of the Attorney General's office has taken different forms, and also through the previous justice minister appointed under Netanyahu's government. So this is not a new development because of just these indictments,
right? Now you're adding another layer, I would say, of complexity to our discussion.
Shucks.
Because our law enforcement institutions, first and foremost, need to deal with questions of crime, corruption, and those matters are in consensus. Israelis do not want to live in a chaotic country where criminals are just have their freedom to perpetrate their crimes. In addition, some of the attempts and initiatives to undermine the independence of the judiciary come from a different place of those who want to ensure that our version of a democracy will be strict. The political majority rules, and the political majority can get its way, and no other institutions should balance it and restrict it in any way, shape, or form. Those people are not corrupt. They just want to introduce in Israel a very narrow, very much reduced version of a democracy. So those are two separate projects that in some way sometimes overlap.
And I want to talk about that in more depth later, but I want to just go finish the conversation about the prime minister. I want to understand one more of his claims. He has said, and many of his colleagues in his party have said, there's one law in Israel for everybody and a different law for Netanyahu, implying that he's being personally sort of targeted somehow by the law enforcement. But I noticed that the Israel Democracy Institute wrote that prior to the municipal elections in 2018, the Attorney General's office adopted a policy of speeding up all investigations against anyone who was under suspicion, possibly going to be indicted, so that the indictments would be published before the local elections for the same reason, so that the voters would have information. So who's right? Is Netanyahu's narrative, does it have any credibility, or would you argue on behalf of the Israel Democracy Institute that the idea that this indictment is being published before the elections is simply the proper procedure that the Attorney General has been undertaking in general in Israeli elections?
Well, the timing of the publication of this decision has been determined a few months ago as the legal preparedness of the legal institution became ripe. Now, the date of the election was set after we knew about the supposed date of the publication of the indictment. Once it became clear to Mr. Netanyahu that the indictment decision is expected anytime around February or March, he dissolved the Knesset as a result of his...
What a coincidence!
And because the elections were supposed to take place anywhere in November, perhaps June, he was very
2019,
persuasive.
we should say, of 2019.
He was very persuasive in explaining to the public why our security challenges are not enabling us to go for an early election. And once he realized that, everything changed and he pushed for an election. So, I mean, that's the number one consideration. The timing was...
So you don't believe he's being personally targeted by the Attorney General?
And number two is the decision, once there's a professional ripeness, the decision to publicize is about the public's right to know, because if there's been work done over the past 3 years to interrogate, to investigate, a lot of data sits within state institutions about that. There's a coherent picture. What would you say? Is it better for the public to know that a month after the election rather than a month and a half before the elections? And that was the policy of the Attorney General, also with respect to the municipal elections. Wherever we can come up and publish a coherent picture, we should do it a month and a half before the election. So as the public goes to vote, they will have now... One can say, well, but it's only a milestone in the way, and then there's a hearing. Well, it's always a milestone because until the last appeal in the Supreme Court, it's a matter of years. So are we not going to publish anything until many years will go by? I mean, it doesn't make sense. It's a significant milestone. There was a significant dozens of people in the Attorney General, in the police, made their work. And now the work should be known to the public as the public goes to elect its prime minister.
Are you disappointed, not you personally, but on behalf of Israeli democracy, that he's not hemorrhaging more support after that, after so many details about his alleged corruption charges have been revealed, that he's still a very likely candidate to be re-elected as prime minister?
We should probably qualify because we don't know what will happen in the surveys over the next couple of weeks. But it's true what Gilad is saying is that the polls that came out immediately after the publication
and
show
also
his
the publication
party
came as no
pretty
surprise to no one.
No, it wasn't a surprise. And polls for Likud stayed pretty much the same.
Yeah, well, I mean, when Israelis decide on their voting pattern and voting decision, how they cast their precious one vote, which is their participation in where this country is heading, one factor is, of course, that they take into account is the ethical conduct of the prime minister, namely, is he or is he not corrupt? But for many Israelis, for example, that the question of Greater Israel is extremely important to them, security conduct, the management of the economy, they're saying, well, I'm unhappy with the prime minister's conduct, but I see myself and my identity, my tribe, quote unquote, resides in that part of the political spectrum. And as a result, I'll have to tolerate with Mr. Netanyahu. He's the head of my camp. This is the camp I belong to. We're seeing and witnessing that the movement of Israelis between political camps is very, very limited. So Israelis are not just, they're very smart, very knowledgeable, probably the most involved constituency in the entire democratic world. And one factor, significant and dramatic as it is, cannot cause such a dramatic shift.
It's because even though they're involved and smart, they're tribal.
Yeah, and you don't shift tribes
so easily.
Like you don't leave your family,
right?
Even if
or your football team.
Exactly.
So before we move on to another section, I want to ask you one last technical question.
Yep.
You said that these people are convinced that Netanyahu is the leader of their tribe, but even if he wins the elections, the Israel Democracy Institute material has pointed out in some very informative background papers that he does not have to become prime minister, even if his party is called upon to lead the government, but the president can call on somebody else inside his party.
Well, in Israel, we do not elect individuals or individual candidates. We elect parties. The ballot has the name of the party, and we elect parties. And we do not elect a prime minister. We elect parties that then in the Knesset form coalitions, and the Knesset elects a prime minister and a government. So once the elections are over, we will have a list of parties, and we do not know. It very much depends on the relationship of power between the different blocs and also the different parties, and there are very interesting and unique scenarios that can emerge. For example, we might have a situation whereby a majority of members of Knesset, more than 61, say of center-left plus Arab parties, they're saying, we are not going to allow to support a Netanyahu government, i.e. Netanyahu will mathematically be unable to form a majority. At the same time, Netanyahu might have more recommendations that the president, say perhaps 57 or 58 members of Knesset, who recommend him to be prime minister more than, say, 50 that Mr. Gantz would have. So then what does the president do?
What does
allow
he do?
Netanyahu to form a government, although there's mathematically no chance he can
Minority
achieve 50,
coalition.
61, and there's no legal option for minority coalition in the state of Israel. Unhappy about it, but you need 61. Or does he allow Mr. Gantz, who has less recommendations, but supposedly, theoretically, still a pave or a pathway to 61? So, and perhaps another member from the Likud will be able to achieve this. So there are some complexities, and we might be, pending the outcome, we might be entering an election day that it will take weeks until we know who is the prime minister after the elections.
But the point is that even if Likud gets the most votes, the plurality of votes, doesn't necessarily mean Netanyahu is going to be prime minister.
Right, and the opposite is also true. Even if Gantz gets more, and obviously everything can change and so on, it still provides no indication that he will form the next government. And I'm not just talking about a small marginal difference of, say, 36 seats versus 34. Even if Gantz gets 36 and Netanyahu gets 28 or 29, we still don't necessarily know who's going to be next prime minister. So our system is in many ways skewed and needs fundamental reform. But at this point in time, we might be witnessing some very
an unstable
weird
post-election situation.
And unstable scenarios.
Unpredictable and very, in Israel, the saying "it's an interesting time to be alive" is a perennial truism.
But today, even more than usual.
Yeah.
Let's talk about some of the recent political developments. It's not all about Netanyahu, although even the big political developments I can think of are all in relation to Netanyahu. But let's try to make it about something else. We had interesting mergers over the last few weeks. We had 3 far-right parties combining into one party called the United Right, by contrast to the New Right. The United Right is a combination of Otzma Yehudit, Jewish Power Party, together with the Beit HaYehudi. And those two parties are, actually there are 3 parties, but they are probably going to enter Knesset now. That was a deal that Netanyahu midwifed. And then we have the merger of the 2 center parties into blue and white. Is the Israeli political system beginning to consolidate finally after, so many years of intense fragmentation, or not?
Well, something significant did happen here. The unification of the 2 centrist parties, the Gantz newly born party and Yair Lapid centrist party, to create centrist party that is wide enough, large enough in order to serve as a legitimate alternative to leading the government and the country is something new, is a surprising development. We did not have an alternative to a Likud-led government for a decade. I believe that given the structure of Israeli public opinion today, that the only real alternative to a right-wing government would be a centrist-led major party. And in this respect, something quite significant took place over the past few weeks. It's not only about Netanyahu, there are other developments. And we are seeing now in the polls that many Israelis have been waiting for such a merger to happen and feel very comfortable with it. Whether on the day after the election, those 2 parties, and in effect also Mr. Ya'alon's entrepreneurial initiative that is more center-right leaning, whether these 3 elements will be able to meld into one major, coherent centrist party that will provide one of two alternatives for years to come, it's yet to be determined. As a Democrat that also believes that we need a good competition over power between two major blocks, and somebody that I believe also that we need politics of two major stable blocks that are leading our politics and competing with each other, I hope this will be the case. But it's yet unknown. It can, if they don't win the election, it can also evaporate and disintegrate again.
Which is what happens to most centrist parties in Israel after one or two cycles, usually.
Yes, and I belonged to one of those in the past.
Yes,
one
you
of
did.
those
The person who was leading your party just left politics a few weeks ago, Tzipi Livni, who was leading the party for part of the time when they had their best result, and now she's gone
No,
entirely.
not when they had the best result. The best result was an election before, when it was led by
29.
Mr. Olmert
Yeah,
and
true.
formed the government. But
How do
But
you
very
think
close-
blue and
very
white?
close number of seats.
How do you think is blue and white different from Kadima?
well, it's a good question. Blue and white is still it's in its nascent stage. So I can't really characterize it yet.
Neither can they.
And, no, I take them very seriously, because I don't think, not only because they have high numbers in the polls, I think that the idea of leading Israel from the center and an idea of a centrist party is not just, well, there's a bunch of people who can't make up their mind if they're right wing or left wing, or they want to be nice to everybody and therefore they define themselves as centrist. I think there's a lot more to it, but one of their major challenges would be to be able to articulate what it means to lead Israel from the center. Kadima wasn't able to do it properly enough, and therefore part of its evaporation was that it didn't articulate the ideas of the center.
What are the ideas of the center?
And it didn't articulate them, and it didn't build around those ideas a group of leaders and of Israelis that are committed to those ideas and committed to implementing them, and therefore once there were
What are
crises, I think
Yeah, what are the ideas of the center in
I
Israel?
think
What does it
that on
stand
the
for?
main axes that define Israeli politics, security and foreign policy being the first axis, the civic, Jewish and democratic, and how do we strike the balance is the second axis, and the third is the axis of social and economy. There is a centrist way in all three of these axes. On the security and foreign policy, if I have to if I would, in my judgment, have to characterize what it means to be a centrist, I would say it's adopting the skepticism and realism of the right with respect to the other side and its intentions with respect to our survival, and more of the left's concern, genuine concern about preserving a Jewish majority. So being just as realistic about the right wing's worries and concerns about the fact that the other side, and taking seriously the other side's intentions to annihilate our state, and at the same time being just as worried about what needs to be done in order to preserve a Jewish majority. This is in the area of security, in the area of how do we strike the balance between our Jewish and democratic component. I think it's offering a real option for being an Israeli, not part of a tribe, not a religious tribe, and not a secular tribe, not a universalist or a halachic
State based on Jewish law.
Yeah, but rather a real balance between the Jewish and democratic component and belonging to the Israeli tribe. So in the social economy, I think it's a free economy plus solidarity, not the version of all our problems are about the government spending more money and taking responsibility for everything, which is the version of some in labor today, and not a more libertarian type approach.
Like Moshe Feiglin.
But what does it say really about the parties as an institution, and about the decline of parties as an institution? Because, I think that part of Kadima's failure is owing to the fact that it relied too heavily on the charisma and leadership of one person, of the founder, Ariel Sharon, and after his departure, it started disintegrating. And conversely, the striking survival of Labour against all odds is also owing to the fact that it is a robust democratic institution that has a life of its own in its way, irrespective of the...
No, I have to do
it's on
some
life
shameless
support,
self-promotion, because Gilad has clearly read my article in 972 magazine about the persistency of ideological commitment to some parties. some of the veteran parties in Israel still matter, but not all of them.
Yeah,
but he's making also another point about the importance of institutions, not only ideas, but institutions.
Yeah,
Right, the
exactly.
parties
So,
themselves.
what do you think in this respect should be, what's guiding blue and white? Do you see that as something that is like
Well,
a major
I'm a
consideration?
big believer in institutions and in the strength of institutions over time.
I would like our listeners to know that you're holding out your fist and shaking it in the air.
So blue and white have no future unless they build a strong institutional foundation. But they also have no future if they don't articulate what it means to be a centrist party. And they also don't have a future if they don't build grain of leaders and leadership, both at the grassroots level, at the faction level, and the number one leader. But it's not only about the number one. You need a group of people. So it's about leadership in the broad sense, it's about institution, and it's about ideas, and it's about melding all of those together because you have a strong commitment to that. The potential is there. So many Israelis define themselves as centrists, although there's no leader that took upon himself or herself to really define what the center is about. There's no successful party that built an institution on that. And nevertheless, it's the most successful and miserably represented idea in Israel's political history. So I think it has a major potential. But since Israelis do not have an instinctive understanding on what it means to be a centrist as opposed to right-wing or left-wing, it very much depends on the quality of leadership. As opposed to say, right-wing leadership, you don't have to explain, you don't have to present a platform, an ideological, because Israelis say, okay, right-wing, I understand what you mean. You don't have to explain. So the onus of proof is on those who are trying to create something new. And so far, we've seen many failures in this ideological dialing code of the Israeli public life.
Well, it's interesting that you talk about so many people who are defined as centrist, because I think most surveys show about a quarter of the adult population, which is a lot. But as we know, the self-defined right wing is bigger. And that's about 45% of the voters, more than 50% of Jews.
Yeah, but how many of them define themselves if you give them the option as center-right or soft-right?
Oh, then you get more. In other words, if you take the center and you try to ask them, are you center-leaning right or left, then you'll get, closer to 55% among Jews who consider themselves right-wing.
But you get a big chunk of Israeli right-wingers that when you ask them what it means when you self-identify as right, they say, well, mainly it means that I don't trust the Arabs and I expect my leadership to be tough.
As you point out, because we have a right-wing government representing the biggest portion of the population, right, which is a plurality or a majority even of Jews, is this right-wing government trying to change our democratic system to be structured in a way that favors the majority at the expense of other groups, because they know that the majority is right-wing?
Let me build on Dalia and add a layer of complexity to that question.
More complexity?
Now, do you think that at some point in the near future, this will be the real bone of contention in Israeli politics? Perhaps like the number one axis on top of the three that you just mentioned? I mean, the system of government, is it going to be majoritarian or...
Are we heading towards a tyranny of the majority?
Well, there's definitely serious pundits who are promoting the idea that being a democracy is can be concluded in adopting the principle of majority rules and reducing the idea of being a democratic state just to that, i.e., a political majority controls everything, controls the courts, controls the nomination of judges, controls all of our basic laws, controls the application of the rule of law, controls the rights of minorities and the rights of individuals and our basic freedoms. This idea is being promoted. It's not the idea of the right wing. You mentioned it's above and beyond the three axes that I meant. It's not, because the second axis was about how do we strike the balance between Israel's Jewish and democratic components of our national character.
So you see the majoritarian component as similar to the Jewish one?
As part of the axis.
It's part of that axis of what it means to be a Jewish and democratic state. And increasingly, those are becoming the issues that are defining our politics and our public life. And there are strong, still not in the majority, but strong interest groups that are pushing for the version of a democracy that removes all constraints from what the majority can do. And it's exceptionally worrying in Israel, in a democracy that has no constitution, that we do not have a Bill of Rights, Our basic freedoms are not secured. We are a fragmented society with many minorities. Each and every one of us in some context can find itself as part of a secular minority, a religious minority, an ultra-Orthodox minority, and therefore we need our democracy strong so it will be able to defend us as individuals. And this is very much an idea that so far is secure, but increasingly under contention.
I have to ask one last question. I mean, if we're looking at a system that favors the majority more, how is Israel planning on preserving its Jewish identity as we continue with expansionist policies that basically put us into the situation of being one state where Jews may be minority? Why would a right-wing government advance majority-oriented policies if we may not be a majority?
Because those who are promoting it, I think that you can, both. We have a saying in Hebrew: "Eat the cake and keep it."
We have it in English too.
Complete.
Eat your cake and have it.
So you can both hold on to territories that include millions of Palestinians, and at the same time not give them rights to vote, and therefore preserve the Jewish majority. I do think that the most important parameter in ensuring Israel's Jewish identity and Jewish majority for decades is ensuring that we have a demographic Jewish majority for many years to come. And you can't legislate and say, okay, now I legislated and defined it as a Jewish state, so it will be there forever, because whoever is in the majority will be able to dictate the rules in the future.
On that happy note, thank you so much for coming back to speak with us. Yohanan Plesner, he's the president of the Israel Democracy Institute, a former member of Kadima. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you.
And thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Georgia Foscarini and Itai Shalem, our producers, and to the Israeli Democracy Institute for their generous support. Now, a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we'd like to ask you to please consider writing a review. You just go to the ratings and review section and write one. You too can support us by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing on our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. We have almost 500 interviews, maybe even more. If you like us, you should also like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast Ideas from Israel. Follow both me and Gilad on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.